My own personal driving force has been climate change as an issue, because it's become so all-encompassing, and I can see that happening back in 88, 30 years ago. I can see that climate change was going to be a preoccupation of our civilization, this century. It's only become more evident over time. But when I tried to think what I could do about climate change, it came back to energy, transport, cities, housing, those sort of things. I mean, I could have worked on food or whatever, but I chose to work on 4 things that were very much interconnected. And all those things are so interconnected, you cannot really think about one without thinking about the others.
In our space, it is about renewable energy and so on, but I mean, energy consumption is just going up.
Yeah, inexorably. Yeah, well, it's partly population going up, isn't it? But I look at the projections of 11.2 billion people by 2100. I just think, oh my God, that is a lot of people to keep supplied with energy and food. And not only the population, but it's also the affluence, consumption per person is going up.
Yep.
So there's a lot of energy right in there, yeah.
And it's about changing behaviours and how do you influence how people use energy. I mean, you mentioned transport as an example. So I think it's interesting for the younger generation. They're now growing up in an era where you don't necessarily need to have your own car. I mean, you have all these.
You might share it, for God's sake.
You might actually share it. You might
it's
have
a radical idea.
You might have autonomous cars driving around, and I mean, why would I want to have my own car that's just very expensive and I need to maintain it and so on? I mean, whereas I could just call a car outside on the street here, and I don't have to worry about where I park it. I mean, it's a whole new concept in terms of how people think about mobility.
Yeah.
It's different.
I see that as being driven by, one of the key factors behind that change in thinking is the technology, of course. It's possible to share cars a lot more easily now than it used to be. I mean, why do we actually need to own a car? If you can share one with your neighbours and it's just to swipe your card and gain access, use it for half an hour, and then return it. In fact, you don't even need to return it to the place of origin.
No.
You can have this sort of free-floating car share idea, which is a great one, I think. But what we've been saying is a good illustration, I think, of how the transport system integrates with energy use and with carbon emissions and with how we run our communities. So, I mean, in terms of the SDGs, I'm thinking, we've got an SDG on energy, SDG 7, but we've also got a sustainable development goal around communities and urban resilience and so on, and we've got a sustainable development goal around climate change and emissions, and so moving from cars to bikes is a great example of how we can improve climate change outcomes.
Yeah.
So the other thing I like is about the SDG framework is things like health integrated in, and I've done quite a lot of work around how active travel, walking and cycling, has health benefits, and the evidence on that is incontrovertible. It's just so strong, and in fact, I did a cost-benefit study of improving active travel in a couple of cities in New Zealand, and far and away the benefit side of the whole equation was dominated by the health benefits. So sure, there were energy benefits and climate change savings, emission reductions from moving away from cars to biking and walking, but the standout result was that the health benefits were so big. So they dominated. So it was a 10-to-1 benefit-cost ratio of moving from cars to bikes. That sort of illustrates quite well, I think, the fact that health and climate change mitigation are very well connected, and also energy is connected to that. Yeah, that brings me back to the question of whether we can afford to move slowly on climate change.
Well, this is my big concern. The way we're heading now is, in my mind, eventually we're not going to be able to, we're not going to get below the 2 degree.
Yeah, the 2 degree Paris agreement target you're thinking of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not because I think we're just moving too slow, and because the lead times to change the overall system is so long.
Yeah.
We've talked about transportation as an example, and the fleet in New Zealand it's between 10 and 15 years, 10 and 20 years old, depending on what part of the fleet you're talking about, and it just takes time for those vehicles to phase out.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like we have 2 decades to sort ourselves out.
No. I am absolutely with you. I think the change is too slow at the moment to get to that target, which is actually, interestingly, not 2 degrees as such. It's well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees. But, and I'm thinking, well, what's at stake here? Like that sounds like an arbitrary target, and people don't necessarily know what 2 degrees means, but a glaciologist, one of the world's expert on melting ice and glaciers and so on, was explaining recently in a lecture that you can think about the 2 degree target as 9 meters of sea level rise, not all at once over a few hundred years, but 9 meters of sea level rise is 3 stories of a building. That is a massive amount of sea level rise, and even if it's slow, decade after decade, rising, that will damage our cities hugely. I mean, in fact, it will make many coastal cities unlivable. And so the stakes here are absolutely enormous. And it's not only, of course, sea level rise, it's heating, drought, impossible living conditions in many cities, people migrating by the millions, by the hundreds of millions, actually. Fires, firestorms, the sort of thing you've seen in California. So if those storms are hitting cities on a regular basis, it just knocks the stuffing out of an economy. And, so we've got to avoid those sort of increases in temperature at all costs, essentially.
Yeah, but somehow it doesn't filter through.
No, I don't think the public's aware of the connection between the behaviours they exhibit, the things they do, and the consequent climate change impacts. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. The only solution long term, if we're going to hit the Paris targets, for example, or get rid of climate change, is to move away from vehicles, because they just involve too much energy and emissions at one stage or another. So, bicycles, walking, those sort of simple things ultimately are the best solution, which are very low-tech solutions in a sense. Yeah.
You're talking about migration and so on.
Yeah, it will affect New Zealand very directly. Yeah,
exactly.
in terms of migration. You only need to think about the 100,000 people in Kiribati who are living in very overcrowded, conditions and very, very threatened by sea level rise and the worsening of storms and so on. So many of them could end up in New Zealand, but it's not just New Zealand that's affected by migration. Almost every country is now, people are knocking on their doors and saying, we want a better life, we want to survive. Look, thinking about it, just looking back over what we've been talking about, what I think we didn't realise 40 years ago, a generation ago, was that climate change would be the total game changer on this. That our systems of energy production and consumption, what we consume around the house and how we produce stuff, it would begin to be totally dominated by this concern about climate change. So I think that's the big shift that's happened between one generation and another. So we now have to think sustainably. Yeah, I mean, for me, the looking, standing back from it, thinking about where we're going and what we need to do. I can do a certain amount myself as an individual. I cycle to work and back. I do a lot of walking. I try not to use the car, try not to fly. But at the end of the day, we need a government that encourages everybody to do that with some very strong incentives to change their behaviour. and that's not just in transport, but it's in energy and
Yeah.
right across the board, because we're not going to solve our energy and climate change problems without a real, a lot of leadership from government.
So, Raph, please go and influence them. Cheers.
Good, cheers.